Flight Lieutenant Mike Hale pushed both throttles through the reheat gate at 36,000 feet over the North Sea, and the English electric Lightning F.3 beneath him did something no interceptor in NATO service could match. The airframe pitched into a near-vertical climb, twin Rolls-Royce Avon 301R engines producing a combined 33,000 pounds of thrust against an aircraft weighing barely more than that fully fueled. On the ground at RAF Wattisham, a controller from No. 56 Squadron watched the radar trace peel off the scope. Hale levelled at 88,000 feet, above the operational ceiling of every Warsaw Pact fighter, then flying, above weather, above the curve of visible horizon. It was 1962, the Soviet MiG-21 F-13, the frontline fishbed, then rolling out of Gorky, could reach 62,000 feet on a good day and hold it for seconds. The Lightning stayed there for minutes, and it did so from a standing scramble in under 3. The aircraft had been designed to a specification the Air Ministry issued in 1947, refined through Operational Requirement F.155, and shaped by a single strategic anxiety inside Whitehall. Soviet Tu-16 Badgers and later Tu-95 Bears would attempt to overfly the United Kingdom, carrying free-fall nuclear weapons aimed at Bomber Command's V-Force dispersal airfields. The RAF had roughly 4 minutes warning from the Type 80 radars at Saxe-Ford, Buchan and Neatishead before contacts crossed the coast. Whatever intercepted them had to climb faster than anything ever built for the RAF, engage at altitudes where jet engines gasped, and do it in the middle of a Lincolnshire night in December. The Ministry of Supply gave the contract to English Electric at Warton. Chief designer W.E.W. Teddy Petter had already left over disagreements about the design. His successor, Freddie Page, pushed the vertically stacked twin-engine configuration through against considerable air staff skepticism. The prototype P.1B serial XA847 first flew on April 4, 1957 from Warton with Roland Beamont at the controls. On its third flight it went supersonic in level flight without reheat, the first British aircraft to do so. Beamont's logbook, now held at the RAF Museum Cosford, records the entry with the flat understatement he preferred. Handling satisfactory, acceleration marked. Duncan Sandys' defence white paper of the same month declared that manned interceptors were obsolete and that surface-to-air missiles would replace them. The Lightning program survived because the air staff quietly ignored the white paper's implications, and the Treasury proved incapable of stopping a contract already signed. By 1959, XM-134 was being delivered to the Air Fighting Development Squadron at Coltishall for service trials. The first operational unit, No. 74 Squadron Tigers under squadron leader John Howe, received its Lightning F-1s at Coltishall in June 1960. Howe, a South African who had shot down a MiG-15 over Korea flying Sabres, understood immediately what he had been given. The aircraft accelerated in a climb. It did not decelerate, as every other interceptor in the world did, as thrust fell off with altitude. It kept accelerating past 40,000 feet. Past 50,000, and the pilot's job became keeping the nose from going through the vertical entirely. The Air Ministry issued no press release. The performance figures were classified and remained so for another decade. In Moscow, the GRU's Air Technical Assessment Section began asking questions about a British aircraft their agents at Farnborough could photograph on the ground, but could not track in the air. In East Germany, a Soviet radar regiment at Cottbus filed a report that Warsaw Pact intelligence initially refused to circulate. The trace, they insisted, must be equipment error. The Cottbus report reached Moscow through 16th Air Army Headquarters at Winsdorf in the late summer of 1963. Warsaw Pact intelligence, working from radar plots captured during a NATO exercise designated Phalanx, showed British aircraft operating from Gütersloh, climbing through 60,000 feet in under 4 minutes from brakes off. The plots were reviewed at the Central Scientific Research Institute of the Air Force in Moscow. The conclusion, preserved in East German Stasi files declassified after 1990 and now catalogued at BSTU in Berlin, was that the British possessed either a rocket-assisted interceptor or the plots were fabricated for deception purposes. Neither was correct. The Lightning achieved what it achieved because Freddie Page had made a set of engineering choices that every other Western designer had rejected. The stacked Avon engines meant that thrust was concentrated on the aircraft's centerline, eliminating the yaw problems that plagued twin-engine designs with wing-mounted power plants. The 60-degree swept wing was thinner in profile than any operational fighter of its generation, giving low transonic drag. Fuel was carried in a ventral pack rather than internal wing tanks, keeping the wing structurally light. The Ferranti AI.23 airpass radar in the nose, the first monopulse airborne intercept radar in Western service, could track a target while the aircraft was pulling 4G in a climb. Nothing else in NATO could do that in 1960. The F-104 starfighter that West Germany operated could reach comparable altitudes but only in a zoom climb from Mach 2 at lower level. It could not sustain the position. The F-106 Delta Dart in USAF service was faster in level flight, but climbed at half the Lightning's rate. The RAF operated the Lightning from 4 principal bases across Britain and Germany. RAF Binbrook in Lincolnshire held numbers 5 and 11 squadrons. RAF Wattisham in Suffolk had numbers 29 and 111. RAF Leuchars in Fife covered the northern approaches with numbers 23 and 74. RAF Gütersloh in the British zone of Germany, 40 miles from the inner German border, held numbers 19 and 92 on quick reaction alert. The Gütersloh Lightnings sat 2 aircraft to a shed with pilots strapped in for 10-minute readiness during periods of tension. Scramble times of under 2 minutes from klaxon to airborne were routinely achieved and occasionally beaten. Wing Commander Peter Van Gucci, who commanded 92 Squadron at Gütersloh in 1971, recorded in the squadron diary that a QRA scramble on March 4th that year had the leading aircraft passing 30,000 feet inside 6 minutes. The intercept profile the Gütersloh squadrons practiced assumed Soviet bomber streams crossing the border in the Fulda Gap, or further north over Lüneburg. Air Vice Marshal Peter Le Cheminot, AOC number. One group in the mid-1960s had told his squadron commanders that the war would be won or lost in the first 90 minutes and that any bomber getting through to the UK mainland represented a failure of the interceptor force. The Lightning's red-top infrared missile, developed by de Havilland propellers at Hatfield, could engage from any aspect rather than only from the rear quarter, which meant a head-on intercept against an inbound Badger was possible, without the vulnerable stern chase that had killed so many interceptor pilots over Korea. 2 red tops and 2 30mm Aden cannon in the ventral pack constituted the armament. It was enough for one pass. Nobody expected a second. Wing Commander Ken Goodwin, who commanded No. 74 Squadron at Leuchars in 1965, kept a personal account of what the aircraft demanded of its pilots. The Lightning did not tolerate mistakes at altitude. Fuel state was the perpetual anxiety. The F.3 variant carried 700 gallons internally and burned it at rates that beggared belief in reheat. Full afterburner consumption exceeded 700 gallons per hour per engine. A high-altitude intercept with reheat used from the climb could leave a pilot with 15 minutes total endurance from brake release. Diversions were planned before every sortie. The saying at Leuchars was that the Lightning had 2 speeds, fast and out of fuel. The overwing tanks fitted to the F.6 variant from 1965 helped, but the aircraft's operational radius never matched what NATO's air staffs wanted from a European interceptor. The intercept business itself was procedural. GCI controllers at the master radar stations vectored the Lightning onto a bearing and altitude, calling ranges as the target came within AI.23 acquisition parameters. The pilot took the intercept from about 20 miles out, transitioning from ground-controlled search to onboard tracking. Red-top head-on engagements were briefed at 10 miles closure. Stern conversions required the pilot to overshoot the target, throttle back, and drop onto the bomber's 6 o'clock while managing the closure rate. Squadron leader Terry Bond of 111 Squadron at Wattisham, interviewed for the RAF Historical Society Journal in 1994, described the sensation of a night-stern conversion at 40,000 feet as flying an office desk through a coal cellar with instruments that lied to you. The bombers the RAF expected to intercept had, by the mid-1960s, become more capable and more numerous. The Tupolev Tu-95 Bear B carried the KH-20 standoff missile, with a 350 nautical mile range and a 2-megaton warhead. The Tu-16 Badger G launched the KH-11 anti-ship, or KH-22 land attack weapon. Long-range aviation exercised these aircraft against NATO regularly. From 1961 onwards, Bear flights out of Oleg on the Kola Peninsula routed southwest into the Iceland-Faroes Gap, tested Norwegian and British air defence responses, and turned home. RAF Loichars scrambled against them on average once a fortnight. The intercepts were photographed. The photographs went to the Defence Intelligence Staff at the Ministry of Defence main building on Whitehall, and copies were passed to the Joint Intelligence Committee. The JIC assessment of Soviet long-range aviation capability, issued as JIC 6537 and now held at the National Archives at Kew in file CAB 158, concluded that the Bear and Badger force could put approximately 180 warheads over the United Kingdom in a first strike. The V force at that time, Vulcans, Victors and the aging Valiants that would be withdrawn in 1965 after wing spar fatigue was discovered, numbered around 140 aircraft on QRA and dispersal airfields. The mathematics of mutual destruction was unforgiving. The Lightning Force, which peaked at around 200 airframes across the frontline squadrons, was not going to stop 180 inbound bombers. It was going to stop enough of them in the first hour that the V-Force could get airborne to retaliate. That was the calculation Sir Solly Zuckerman had made as Chief Scientific Advisor, and that successive chiefs of the Air Staff, from Sir Thomas Pike to Sir John Grandy, had accepted. The Lightning was not a war winner, it was a war buyer. October 1962 tested every assumption in the calculation. The Cuban Missile Crisis was, in the memory of most participants, an American affair conducted from the cabinet room of the White House, with Robert Kennedy at his brother's elbow. From the British side, it was a period of the highest RAF alert states since 1945. Bomber Command went to Alert Condition 3 on October 27, 1962, meaning V-bombers armed with Yellow Sun or Blue Steel weapons were on cockpit readiness at their dispersal airfields. Fighter Command's Lightning squadrons went to full QRA with additional aircraft generated from training and second-line units. Air Marshal Sir Douglas Morris, C&C Fighter Command, ordered that Loichars and Gütersloh maintain 4 aircraft rather than 2 on immediate readiness. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan managed the crisis from Admiralty House while 10 Downing Street was undergoing structural repairs. His diary entry for October 22, 1962, held at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, records a cabinet in which the Chief of the Defence Staff, Lord Mountbatten, briefed on the alert state of British forces without recommending a further increase. Macmillan agreed. He was concerned that a public British mobilisation would harden Soviet resolve rather than deter it, and he had a working telephone relationship with John F. Kennedy that he wished to preserve. The transcripts of the Macmillan-Kennedy calls during the crisis, 21 in total across 13 days, are preserved at the Kennedy Library in Boston. In one on October 24th, Macmillan cautioned against boarding a Soviet ship at sea, warning that it would give Moscow a legitimate grievance. Kennedy took the advice. The Lightning squadrons at Gütersloh spent the crisis in the sheds. Soviet air activity over East Germany increased noticeably in the last week of October, tracked by the Type 84 radar at RAF Bruggen and by the Signals Intelligence Station at RAF Gatow in West Berlin, which intercepted Warsaw Pact air traffic control transmissions. The GCHQ station at Gatow, staffed by RAF linguists, working under the cover designation of Number 26 Signals Unit, logged an unusual number of Soviet fighter regiments going to combat readiness in the group of Soviet forces Germany. None of this reached the newspapers. The British public understood the crisis as a naval quarantine in the Caribbean. The men at Gütersloh understood it as the closest thing to a war-starting week that the Cold War would produce. The crisis ended on October 28th when Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba. The RAF stood down from Alert 3 over the following week. What the Lightning Force took from those 13 days was procedural. Scramble times had held. Aircraft availability across the front-line squadrons had exceeded 85% at the peak of the alert. The command and control system from the master radar stations through the sector operations centers to the squadrons had worked. The intelligence picture from GCHQ Cheltenham and its outstations had been sufficient. Air Chief Marshal Sir Kenneth Cross, AOC in Sea Bomber Command, wrote to the Chief of the Air Staff on November 15th that the alert had demonstrated the readiness of the V-Force and the deterrent posture of the interceptor screen. He added a warning. The next crisis, he suggested, would come with less warning and require a faster reaction. The Lightning's replacement, if there was to be one, would need to sit further forward and see further out. That aircraft was already being sketched at the Air Staff. It would not enter service for another 17 years. The Lightning Force in the second half of the 1960s did not shrink, but reorganized. The F.6 variant entering service from 1965 gave the interceptor an operational endurance more suited to the northern approaches and the transit to the Iceland-Faroes UK gap. The overwing tanks added 260 gallons. The enlarged ventral pack held 610. A Lightning F-6 could remain airborne for over an hour without air-to-air refueling, which was an improvement on the F.3 measured in orders of magnitude. Air-to-air refueling from Handley Page Victor tankers of No. 55 and 57 squadrons at RAF Marham extended that further. In 1969, Lightnings of 74 Squadron flew from Tenga in Singapore to Akrotiri in Cyprus with Victor support, a distance of some 4,000 miles, on the withdrawal from the Far East that Dennis Healey's 1968 Defence Review had ordered. The Defence Review itself was a hinge in British Cold War posture. Healey, as Defence Secretary in the Wilson Cabinet, faced a Treasury insistent that the defence budget be capped at 6% of GDP and a strategic requirement that would not shrink to fit. The decision to withdraw from east of Suez by 1971 was made in January 1968, after devaluation of the pound the previous November made the Persian Gulf and Singapore commitments unaffordable. What Healey did preserve was the nuclear deterrent, the BAOR commitment to Germany, and the air defence of the United Kingdom. The Lightning Force was central to the third of those. The V-Force was central to the first. BAOR, the British Army of the Rhine, with 1st British Corps holding the northern German plain from a line running roughly from Hanover to Kassel, was central to the second. The intelligence picture that justified this posture came from multiple sources. GCHQ at Cheltenham moved there from Eastcote in 1952, and now expanding into the Oakley and Benhall sites, monitored Warsaw-packed military communications through outstations at Chicksands in Bedfordshire, Cheadle in Staffordshire, and Gartow in Berlin. MI6 ran agents in Eastern Europe with varying degrees of success. The most valuable had been Colonel Oleg Penkovsky of the GRU, whose material on Soviet missile capabilities passed to the Anglo-American Joint Case in 1961-62, had given Washington the intelligence to identify the missiles in Cuba. Penkovsky was arrested in October 1962, tried in May 1963, and executed. His British case officer, Rory Chisholm of the Moscow station, and Chisholm's wife Janet, who had run the physical handovers in Moscow parks, had already been withdrawn. The Penkovsky material, catalogued in files still partially closed at TNA in the KV series, remained the gold standard for Cold War human intelligence for the rest of the decade. The Joint Intelligence Committee met weekly in the Cabinet Office. Its chairman from 1968 to 1972 was Sir Edward Peck, a Foreign Office professional. The JIC produced weekly assessments and periodic in-depth papers on Soviet capabilities and intentions. The papers went to the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Defense Secretary, and the Chiefs of Staff. The Lightning Squadrons never saw them. What the squadrons saw was the tactical intelligence that filtered down through the sector operations centers. Bomber deployment patterns, exercise activity, the flight profiles of individual regiments identified by their signals traffic. When Soviet long-range aviation flew a training exercise, RAF Luchars knew about it before the aircraft crossed the North Cape. The GCHQ contribution was decisive and largely unacknowledged even inside the RAF. In 1969, the system faced its first serious test since 1962. The place was not Berlin or Cuba. It was Czechoslovakia, and the moment had already passed. The Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia on the night of August 20th to 21st, 1968 caught the JIC out. A paper circulated on August 19th had judged Soviet military intervention unlikely in the short term. The intervention began the following night. Approximately 250,000 troops from the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Hungary and Bulgaria crossed the Czechoslovak borders. Alexander Dubček was arrested in Prague. The Prague Spring ended. The failure of British intelligence to predict the invasion led to a review by Sir Dick White, the Cabinet Office Intelligence Coordinator, which found that the JIC had weighted political indicators too heavily and military indicators too lightly. GCHQ signals traffic from the days before the invasion had shown Soviet units repositioning. The pattern had not been recognized in time. The Lightning Force went to increased readiness on the night of August 20th as the picture became clear at RAF Strike Command headquarters at High Wycombe. The command had been formed in April that year from the merger of Bomber Command and Fighter Command, an economy measure that Air Chief Marshal Sir Wallace Kyle presided over and quietly disapproved of. Strike Command's first serious alert came within 4 months of its establishment. Güterslow's Lightnings sat 2 aircraft to the shed for 72 hours. Nothing crossed the border. The Warsaw Pact operation had been directed inward, at a member state that had strayed from orthodoxy, not outward at NATO. Prime Minister Harold Wilson, briefed at Chequers on the morning of August 21st, told his private secretary that the West could do nothing about the invasion beyond protest, which was correct. What followed was a period of relative stability in the European confrontation, broken by moments of intense concern. The Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt from 1969, the strategic arms limitation talks between Washington and Moscow, the Helsinki Final Act of 1975. These produced a diplomatic architecture that made general war less immediately probable and made specific crises more manageable. The Lightning Force operated inside this architecture without being of it. QRA continued. Bear flights south of Iceland continued. In 1970, No. 5 Squadron at Binbrook logged 47 QRA scrambles against Soviet aircraft in the northern intercept zone. In 1972, the figure was 62. The aircraft the RAF was intercepting had not changed dramatically. The Tu-95 Bear D reconnaissance variant, in service from 1967, was the frequent flyer. The Lightning that met them was, by the mid-1970s, an aging aircraft. Design decisions taken in 1954 constrained what could be modified. The AI.23 radar had been upgraded to AI.23B standard, but its detection range against low-flying targets remained poor. The Red Top missile was reliable but limited in envelope. The pilot workload in a single-seat aircraft doing its own radar work while flying an intercept at 50,000 feet was punishing. The RAF had known since the mid-1960s that a replacement was needed. The question was what and when. The F-4 Phantom II, ordered from McDonnell Douglas in 1964, in a variant designated FG.1 and FGR.2, and re-engined with Rolls-Royce Spey turbofans at Air Staff insistence, entered RAF service from 1969. The Phantom was intended to replace the Lightning in the air defense role. It never entirely did so. Two-seat crew, better radar, longer range but slower climb and lower ceiling. The Lightning kept doing what only the Lightning could do, the fast climb, the high intercept, while the Phantom did everything else. And beyond the Phantom, a new project was gathering pace. Air Staff Target 396 called for an aircraft that could patrol the North Atlantic for 4 hours and see 200 miles. It would take a decade to build. Air Staff Target 396 became the Panavia Tornado ADV, the air defense variant. But before it flew, the Lightning had another decade to serve, and the Cold War had one more sustained period of dangerous tension to produce. The years 1979 to 1985 saw the sharpest deterioration in East-West relations since the early 1960s. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, the deployment of SS-20 intermediate-range missiles in Eastern Europe from 1977, and the NATO dual-track decision of December 1979 to deploy Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles in response, all reshaped the strategic environment. Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister from May 1979, brought a colder tone to British engagement with Moscow than Wilson or Callaghan had. Her first major foreign policy speech at Kensington Town Hall in January 1976, while still leader of the opposition, had earned her the sobriquet Iron Lady from the Soviet press. She had welcomed it. The Lightning Force at Binbrook, the last operational base by the 1980s holding numbers 5 and 11 squadrons, was by then flying aircraft that had been built in the early 1960s. Airframe fatigue was a constant concern. Squadron leader Steve Riley, an 11 squadron pilot in 1985, recorded that engineering hours per flight hour on the Lightning approached 90, roughly triple the ratio of a modern aircraft. What kept the type in service was that nothing else in RAF service could climb like it, and the intercept task in the northern approaches still demanded that climb. November 1983 produced the crisis that historians now regard as the closest post-1962 approach to nuclear war. Exercise Able Archer 83, a NATO command post exercise held from 7th to 11th November, simulated the release procedures for nuclear weapons in a European conflict. Soviet intelligence, operating under the Andropov-directed Operation RYAN, a Russian acronym for nuclear missile attack, had been tasked since 1981 to look for indicators of a Western first strike. Able Archer's realism, including the use of new codes and unusual message formats, was read in Moscow as possible cover for actual preparation. Soviet nuclear forces went to heightened alert. Warsaw-packed air units in East Germany were placed on combat readiness. The material on this came out through Oleg Gordievsky, MI6's most valuable Soviet source since Penkovsky, then serving as KGB resident designate in London. Gordievsky had been recruited by MI6 in Copenhagen in 1974 and run by the Century House Soviet section for the next 11 years. His reporting on Able Archer passed to the Prime Minister through the Cabinet Office and to the Americans by Sir Geoffrey Howe as Foreign Secretary, informed the transatlantic understanding of how close the exercise had come to being misread as war. Thatcher's private response, recorded in the papers of her foreign policy advisor, Sir Percy Craddock, now at Churchill College, Cambridge, was that the incident demonstrated the need for direct dialogue with a new generation of Soviet leadership. Konstantin Chernenko, elderly and ill, would not provide that. Not. When Gordievsky reported in early 1984 that Mikhail Gorbachev, a candidate member of the Politburo, might be that generation, Thatcher invited him to Chequers. The visit took place on December 16, 1984, 3 months before Gorbachev became General Secretary. Thatcher's briefing had been prepared by Craddock's staff at the Cabinet Office and by the Foreign Office's Soviet Department, using Gordievsky's material without ever revealing its source to any officials outside a very small circle. Her verdict, given to the BBC on the Chequers steps, was that she could do business with Mr. Gorbachev. It was the diplomatic breakthrough of the decade. The Lightnings at Binbrook, meanwhile, continued to scramble. The Lightning was retired from RAF service in June 1988. The final operational sorties were flown by Numbers 5 and 11 squadrons from Binbrook on April 30th, 1988, with a formal disbandment parade on June 30th. The Tornado F-3, the interceptor version of the ADV, took over the air defence task from bases at Coningsby, Leeming and Luchas. The Tornado could patrol for 4 hours 400 miles from base, carry 4 Skyflash medium-range missiles and 4 Sidewinders, and see targets at ranges the Lightning's radar could not have imagined in 1957. What it could not do was climb like a Lightning. It did not need to. The threat had changed. Soviet long-range aviation was still flying bears south of Iceland, but the ballistic missile submarine had long since displaced the bomber as the primary Soviet nuclear delivery system, and the interception task had shifted from the vertical to the horizontal. Long-range patrol, positive identification, escort to the ADIZ boundary. Gorbachev's reforms from 1985 onwards, perestroika, glasnost, the negotiation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in Washington in December 1987, that eliminated SS-20 and Pershing II, reshaped the environment the Lightning had been built for. Thatcher's role as the Western leader who had first identified Gorbachev as different and had cultivated the relationship through his early years in power was more significant than any RAF interception. The intelligence architecture, GCHQ, MI6, the JIC, the Defense Intelligence Staff, had provided the material that let London see Moscow more clearly than Moscow saw London. The Gordievsky operation, run out of MI6's Century House headquarters until his exfiltration from Moscow in July 1985 in Operation Pimlico, was the single greatest human intelligence success of the late Cold War from any Western service. The Cold War ended not with an interception but with a series of political collapses. The Berlin Wall fell on the night of November 9th to 10th, 1989. Thatcher at Chequers that weekend was privately less enthusiastic about German reunification than her public statements suggested. Her memoranda to Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd, now at the Thatcher Foundation Archive, expressed concerns about the pace and about the balance of power in a unified Germany that would prove prescient. The Warsaw Pact dissolved formally on July 1st, 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved on December 26, 1991, when the red flag came down over the Kremlin. The Lightning by then was in museums. Airframes went to the RAF Museum at Hendon, the Imperial War Museum at Duxford, the Newark Air Museum, and to private collections. 2 continued to fly for a period in South Africa with Thunder City, and are grounded now. Wing Commander Aldwell of 5 Squadron, who had flown Lightnings from 1976 to 1988, wrote in his retirement letter that the aircraft had done exactly what had been asked of it for 30 years. It had climbed faster than anything else. It had held the northern approaches. It had made the arithmetic of Soviet nuclear planning marginally harder. It had never fired a weapon in anger. That, Aldwell wrote, was the point. Deterrence works when weapons stay unused. Britain's Cold War posture between 1945 and 1991 had rested on 3 legs: the independent nuclear deterrent, the BAOR commitment to Germany, and the air defence of the United Kingdom. The Lightning had held the third for a generation. What replaced it eventually retired in its own turn. What the Lightning had proved was narrower and harder to see. A medium-sized power with limited resources and a clear strategic requirement could build a weapon system that its principal opponent could not match, and that its principal ally did not need. Freddie Page's engineers at Warton had done that, working to an air staff requirement drafted at Adastral House in 1947. The aircraft they built kept climbing until it was told to stop.